and spiritual interests and don't find their equals on the earth only. This is an unsolved mystery to us. Billy says, should I now laugh, cry, curse, or be grateful? Semyaza says, none of everything. You just have to accept the fact, nothing else. Billy says, I give up, otherwise I'll go insane. Semyaza says, a life form with your spiritual and consciousness-related state can no longer become insane so easily, if vicious, external force isn't used. Billy says, then just not I give up, really. Semyaza says that you won't because you yourself know very well that it is actually in such a way as I say. Billy says, man oh man, of course I know that, but why must we always just talk about such things that I know? I know this now, and that should be enough. Semyaza says, don't get excited, I know how bad you often feel because you can't talk to anyone about it. Thus, you are also lonely in this world. But you can talk with me about everything because I understand the sense of your words and thoughts. Accustom yourself to this, then, you will no longer excite yourself. Billy says, thanks, I will try, even though it will be damn difficult. Semyaza says, I think that I will now go again, for I wouldn't want to burden you. Billy says, that's nonsense, because for the first time in my life, I feel really good. It also seems to me as though we've already known each other for thousands of years. I am really very happy. Semyaza says, then it's fine. Shall we talk, then, about something else, or shall I tell you the history of mankind? Billy says that can still wait, because through our word fencing, I've bumped into entirely different thoughts. Semyaza says, as you wish, I make no rules for you. Billy says, if others had just a small part of your understanding, then life wouldn't be difficult so often. But let's leave this now because I really have a question. I deal a lot with parapsychological problems and often bump into things that are great mysteries to me. But on the other hand, some people are known to me by name and reputation, who bear some of the doctor's titles and even professor's titles of parapsychological degrees. In long-winded speeches, they often try to make any parapsychological phenomena plausible to the layman, whereas I often designate these explanations as acute spinning and even as idiocy because they cannot claim any understanding from me. What should I do about this, as this is often heavily felt by others? Semyaza says you shouldn't do anything against it, for in most cases, your view is correct, though you also have to perceive idiocy as such. Unfortunately, it is common with you that so-called scholars sit on some doctors' chairs and professors' chairs, who, in truth, are not scholars. A doctor or a professor of parapsychology, as you call this field, should also actually be a parapsychologist. This means that such a scholar would have to have paranormal abilities, otherwise, he can't be called a parapsychologist and will also never be capable of bringing any basic insights into this area. Billy says, how does it stand with the so-called spiritual healers? Semyaza says countless of them are plain frauds and charlatans, who only rely on the firm erroneous belief of their patients and supporters, through which these heal themselves unconsciously and in a faith-related manner. However, there are also many who are actually capable of using their consciousness forces for the well-being of their fellow men. Billy says, may I also learn names? Semyaza says, sure, but you should keep them to yourself, for at least in this respect, we don't want to harm deceivers and failures, in order to avoid further evil. But primarily, the greatest frauds bear the greatest and most respected names, while the real experts are usually as good as unknown. Billy says, thanks, that's sufficient. Names also aren't so important. But what would still interest me is this: have you ever heard of UG, or is he somehow familiar to you? Semyaza says we follow a lot of events on Earth, so we have also become aware of him. He possesses certain mental powers, but which he himself isn't able to control. Any venture of his forces certain consciousness-related forces out of his fellow human beings. This means that he activates the consciousness forces of many people unconsciously, for he is unable to control this, and these people then, also unconsciously, provide him assistance in his venture. His own consciousness-related abilities wouldn't be sufficient for a venture. Billy says that's about what I supposed. Semyaza says don't be so modest because I know that you've directly encountered the core of it. You always present yourself as more unknowing than you are in truth. Why? Billy says so without his dear fellow human beings, he would be a zero and couldn't use his minimally developed abilities. Concerning your question, however, I wouldn't like to answer it. Semyaza says sure, that's it. So then, if you don't want to respond to my question, then so be it. Billy says I've suspected this, I mean with regard to UG. Semyaza says you've known this. Billy says okay, I've known this, and I also believe to know that UG is a fraud in this matter, since he claims that he has been in a UFO. In my opinion, he heard about UFOs for the first time in America. Semyaza says even here, you have inferred very accurately, for he has never even come into the vicinity of a beam ship or ever entered one. But he already heard of UFOs in Israel and not just in America, as you suppose. A lot of people already know that he is a beam ship fraud, however, and thus, his name is in the mouths of many. Therefore, we may still calmly call him here UG. Billy says isn't that unfair? Semyaza says no, because he and his manager are willing to publish fraudulent contact reports, which can be seen here to be untrue through his name designation. It is, in fact, already enough that certain frauds like George Adamski and K. Michalek, etc. have driven many people into delusion and misery. Billy says as you wish. But now, I've brought along a whole list of questions that were presented to me and for which I should ask you for an answer. Semyaza says are these questions from your circle of friends? Billy says yes, but these are also questions that often occupy myself. Semyaza says very well, then ask. Billy says the most mentioned question is whether I may also bring friends of mine, etc., to our meetings. Semyaza says that can't happen, unfortunately. The reasons for this are well known to you. If I would allow that, then we could officially turn ourselves to the whole of humanity. But the fact that we have not yet done this and never will, I have already talked about this in detail. Billy says sorry. Semyaza says I only gave you an answer to your question. Billy says the apology isn't for me but for all of those for whom I have directed the question to you. Semyaza says of course, I should have known that. Billy says my next question deals with the earthly human races. We have here yellow, red, white, brown, and black people. How does it work with them? Why are there these differing colors? Semyaza says this actually belongs in the history of Earth humanity, which I still wanted to pass on to you. But I want to answer the question for you now, and I can spare myself these remarks later. On Earth, there aren't just the 5 color races specified by you, it's just that the others are completely unknown to you. In part, they live in places where no human being has been able to find them yet, partly. Billy says do you mean that they live, perhaps, underground, such as the assertion is that this is the case in Mexico, or that they live under domes in inaccessible mountains or inside of hills, about which also incredible things are told? Semyaza says sure, and here and there, these races also go into the world of the sun and mingle with the surface inhabitants. Particularly in countries with many races, they aren't noticeable and can move around unencumbered, especially if they veil their faces in a nationally traditional way. It is even more difficult when their complexion is very striking, so for example bluish, who? Billy says live in the Indian area, yes? Semyaza says you know this. Billy says I have eyes in my head. Semyaza says of course, but you've outrun me once again. But further, I wanted to say that some differently colored races already became extinct again a long time ago. but they are all equally the product of the celestial